He thought his night nurse was stealing from him. For 3 weeks, he watched her sneak out with bags she never brought in. In his world, betrayal meant one thing: death. Marcus Wellington was 37 years old. He controlled half of Chicago's criminal empire. Casinos, ports, money laundering, real estate. Everything. He noticed everything. Every number, every deal, every flicker of fear in someone's eyes. Except the woman who cleaned his blood, stained floors every night. Her name was Alina. She'd worked in his mansion for 3 years. When his men came back wounded, she stitched them up. No questions asked. When someone died in his living room, she scrubbed the floors until nothing remained. She moved through his empire like a ghost. Quiet, faithful, invisible, but Marcus never asked about her life. Never wondered where she went after midnight. Never noticed the shadows under her eyes, or the way her hands shook when she thought nobody was watching. Until 3 weeks ago, Marcus noticed Alina leaving his mansion at night, carrying 2 heavy bags she didn't bring in that morning. It kept happening. Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, same bags, same time, same route, into the darkness. His mind went cold. She's stealing something, or worse, she's selling information. He ran checks. His safe, his documents, his weapons. Nothing missing, but those bags kept appearing. And in his world, unanswered questions were dangerous. What's she hiding? So on a rainy Thursday night, Marcus decided to follow her himself. He dismissed his guards, took his car, parked down the block, and waited. When Alina walked out, coat pulled tight against the rain, bags weighing down her thin shoulders, Marcus's jaw tightened. His hand rested on the gun beneath his jacket. Tonight, he'd know the truth, and if she'd betrayed him, tonight would be her last. But what waited for him in the darkness of Southside was something no amount of power could have prepared him for. Something that would crack open the walls he'd spent 37 years building. Something that would force him to face every terrible thing he'd ever done. And it all started with a woman who had nothing, giving everything to the people he destroyed. Alina didn't call a taxi. She walked 2 blocks in the rain, shoulders hunched low, the bags pulling her thin body off balance. Marcus drove slowly behind her, keeping just enough distance to stay hidden. She stopped at the bus shelter on Halsted Street. Standing alone under a torn roof, the rain kept falling. She didn't have an umbrella. Marcus sat in the car, watching the rainwater slide down her old coat. Why would a traitor travel this way? The bus arrived. Alina stepped on and disappeared behind the fogged windows. Marcus let his car roll forward after it. Bus Route 17. He knew this line. It ran straight south, cutting through neighborhoods even the police didn't want to enter. Neighborhoods that belonged to him. The bus turned onto State Street, passed through a brightly lit shopping area, then slowly sank into darkness. Street lights grew sparse. Tall buildings gave way to old apartment buildings. Windows boarded shut, walls stained with peeling paint. Marcus recognized every street: 51st Street, 55th Street, 63rd Street. The Southside, 15 years ago, this place had been full of life. Families, children, corner stores, churches open every Sunday. Then Marcus came. He bought one building at a time, one block at a time, one street at a time, not to build. To destroy. He needed empty land for a new port, for warehouses, for operations nobody was allowed to question. He forced hundreds of families onto the streets. Those who refused to leave were handled differently. A fire here, an accident there. A few deaths nobody investigated. The South Side became a dead zone. And Marcus never came back until tonight. The bus stopped at 63rd Street. Alina stepped off. Marcus parked 1 block away. Killed the lights and watched. She walked faster now, as if she knew every step by heart. She turned left into a dark alley and disappeared behind crumbling brick walls. Marcus stepped out of the car. The rain had eased, but the air was still damp, heavy with the smell of rotting trash and sewer water. He followed, his footsteps silent, the instincts of a hunter sharpened over 20 years in the dark. The alley led him past piles of rubble, past rusted, abandoned cars, past a children's playground with broken swings. A slide covered in spray paint. He recognized the place. This had once been Lincoln Park of the Southside. He had ordered it destroyed 12 years ago to build a parking lot for a casino, but the project was canceled, and the park became a graveyard of broken dreams. Elena stopped in front of an old building, St. Mary's Church. Cracked walls, a leaning bell tower, stained glass windows shattered long ago. But there was a faint glow coming from the basement. Elena knocked. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. The door opened. Yellow light spilled into the dark alley. A hand pulled her inside, the door shut. Marcus stood in the shadows, his heart beating slow and steady. He didn't know what was waiting behind that door, but he would find out. He stepped forward, placed his hand on the rotting wooden door, and pushed. The staircase leading down to the basement was narrow and dark. Marcus went down 1 step at a time. His back pressed to the wall, his hand still resting on his gun. Voices murmured from below, the sound of bowls and spoons. The sound of children laughing. He stopped on the final step, hid behind the corner of the wall, and looked. The basement was larger than he expected. Bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light over a room packed with people. 15, maybe 20. They sat on old plastic chairs, on torn mattresses, on the cold concrete floor. In front of them were steaming bowls of soup, loaves of bread, bottles of water, and in the center of the room, standing behind a long wooden table, was Elena. Marcus didn't recognize her at first. The Elena he knew always kept her head down, always silent, always fading into the shadows as if she didn't exist. But the woman standing before him now was different. She was smiling, a warm, gentle smile, as if this damp basement was the only place in the world where she was allowed to be herself. Her hair fell loose instead of being neatly tied. She wore an old sweater, worn thin at the shoulders. A ladle in her hand as she poured soup into each bowl. She called everyone by name. "Mr. Harold, I added extra potatoes for you today. Mrs. Miller, your medicine is on the corner of the table. Remember to take it after you eat." She knew them. Every single one. Marcus stood there, unable to move. His eyes swept across the room, and the faces began to register. The man sitting in the left corner, unshaven, hollow-eyed, he ate his soup with one hand, the other was gone. More precisely, his left leg was gone as well. The empty pant leg was neatly folded beneath the knee. David Patterson. Marcus remembered the name. 11 years ago, David had been one of his most reliable men. Until a job at the docks failed. $2 million vanished. Marcus didn't care whether David was innocent or not. He needed to make an example for the others. He ordered his men to take David's leg, not to kill him, but to remind everyone what failure cost. David was thrown onto the street like a dog. Marcus never thought of him again. And now David was sitting here in the basement of a ruined church, eating soup cooked by Marcus's own housekeeper. Elena walked over to David and placed another loaf of bread beside him. "Mr. David, how is your leg today?" "I brought your pain medication." David looked up at her, his tired eyes shining with something Marcus couldn't name. "Thank you, my dear. You're the only angel left in this hell." Marcus swallowed hard. He turned his gaze to the right side of the room. A young woman sat there, holding 2 children in her arms. The older one was about 7. A girl with blonde hair tied in a ponytail. The younger was about 5. A boy asleep against his mother's shoulder. Sophie Donovan. Marcus remembered her, not because she mattered, but because her husband once did. Frank Donovan, one of the sharpest accountants in his empire. Frank knew too much, and when Frank started to grow a conscience, started wanting out, Marcus handled it the only way he knew. Frank disappeared one winter night 3 years ago. Nobody ever found. Sophie was thrown out of the apartment Marcus provided for employees. She lost her job, her home, her husband, and Marcus never thought of her again. But now Sophie was sitting here, her 2 thin children in her arms, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep, yet still lighting up with hope as Elena approached. "Miss Bell, do you have cookies today?" the little girl asked. Emma, right? Elena knelt down and pulled 2 cookies wrapped in foil from her pocket. These are just for Emma and Ryan. Remember to share with your brother. The little girl took the cookies, her eyes shining as if she had been given the whole world. Thank you, Miss Bell. You're the best person in the world. Something tightened in Marcus's throat. He looked around the room once more, the homeless old man, the widow, the discarded former worker, the widows of men he had killed, children made fatherless by him. They all shared one thing. They were his victims. And Elena, the woman he suspected of betrayal, was using every dollar of her small paycheck to keep alive the people he had crushed. Right under his nose, for 3 years the bags hadn't carried stolen goods. They carried food, medicine, warm blankets. They carried everything she had. She was giving away everything to those who had nothing left, to those from whom he had taken everything. Marcus stood in the shadows, his hand still on the gun, but his fingers no longer clenched. He had come here to find a traitor. He had found a saint. Marcus stepped back before anyone could see him. He climbed the stairs, came out into the alley, and stood there. The rain began to fall again, light but cold, slowly soaking through his expensive coat. He didn't know how long he stood there. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. He only knew that when the basement door finally opened and Elena came up, the bags now completely empty, he was still standing in the same place. Elena saw him immediately. She stopped. The light from the basement brushed across her face, then vanished as the door shut behind her. Darkness swallowed them both, but she didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there looking at him with tired eyes that held no fear. Marcus stepped closer. Only a few feet separated them now. He could see raindrops clinging to her lashes. Could see her shoulders tremble slightly from the cold. Could see an old bruise on her wrist that he had never noticed before. How long? His voice was low and cold, as if he were asking about a business report rather than something that had broken everything he thought he knew. Elena didn't hesitate. 3 years. Since the day I walked into your house. 3 years. For 3 years, she had moved back and forth inside his empire, wiping blood from his floors, stitching wounds for his men, and using every dollar of her paycheck to keep alive the people he had destroyed. Right in front of him. Why? Marcus didn't know why he asked. In his world, reasons didn't matter, only actions and results. But he needed to know. He needed to understand why a woman with nothing would be willing to give everything to strangers. Elena was silent for a moment. The rain fell harder, rattling against the rusted tin roofs of the abandoned buildings around them. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. Because I know who they are. I know who they were before you took everything from them. She stepped forward 1 pace, her eyes locking onto his. Mr. David used to be a mechanic, raising 3 children, before you turned him into a worker and threw him away like trash. Sophie used to be a kindergarten teacher. She had a happy family before you killed her husband and put her on the street. Mrs. Miller used to be a nurse. She saved hundreds of lives until her son owed money to your casino, and she lost everything to buy him back. Her voice didn't shake. There were no tears, only truth, bare and sharp as a blade. They aren't trash, mister Wellington. They're human beings, and you crushed them as if they'd never existed. Marcus stood still. Rain streamed down his face, but he didn't wipe it away. He'd heard thousands of pleas in his life, thousands of sobs, thousands of curses, but nobody had ever spoken to him like this, without fear, without hatred. Only truth. You know I could kill you right now. His voice was low. I know. Eleanor replied, not blinking. But that doesn't change the truth. You can kill me, but you can't kill what I said, because you know I'm right. Marcus said nothing. He turned and walked toward the car waiting in the shadows. But before he disappeared into the rain, Elena's voice followed him. You don't need to follow me anymore, Mr. Wellington. I'll still be here every night until nobody needs me anymore, or until you decide that kindness is a crime worthy of death. Marcus didn't turn back. He got into the car, closed the door, and sat there in the dark. For the first time in 37 years, he didn't know what to do next. Marcus didn't return to the mansion that night. He drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Chicago until morning came. His mind spun with images he couldn't erase. David Patterson and the missing leg, Sophie Donovan and her 2 thin children, little Emma with her eyes lighting up as she received a cookie, and Alina with a smile he had never seen. Alina with a voice that didn't tremble when she stood before a man who could kill her at any moment. By the time he returned to the mansion, the sun was already high. He called Theo into his study and gave the order in a voice rough from a sleepless night. I want to know everything about Alina Monroe. Everything from the day she was born to this very moment. Don't miss a single detail. Theo looked at him for a long time. After 20 years as Marcus's right hand, he'd seen everything. But he'd never seen his boss like this. Tired, yes, but not only from lack of sleep. There was something else. Something Theo couldn't name. Yes, sir. 24 hours later, Theo placed a thick file on Marcus's desk. He said nothing, simply stood there waiting. Marcus opened the file. The first page was Alina's photograph, taken 3 years earlier when she applied for the job. A thin face, hollow eyes, yet something soft remained. Not completely worn away by life. Below it was her basic information. Alina Marie Miller, the name she had used to apply for the job. 27 years old, born and raised in Chicago. Father Robert Monroe, mother Catherine Monroe, younger brother Samuel Monroe. Marcus turned to the deeper layers of the background check, where her true identity had been discovered. Her real name, Alina Monroe. Father Robert Monroe, accountant. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He didn't need to read every detail to understand the horror he had created. The names in the file, Robert, Catherine, Samuel, were not just records, but the ghosts of a family he had carefully erased. He had crushed their lives under the weight of his empire, yet the sole survivor of his cruelty was the very woman who now stood in his home, mending his men's wounds and cleaning his blood-stained floors. His hands trembled as the weight of his sins, long forgotten, finally came back to claim him. And she'd still walked into his house every day, still wiped blood from his floors, still stitched wounds for his men, still called him sir in a gentle voice for 3 years. She could have poisoned him, could have stabbed him in his sleep, could have sold information to his enemies, but she didn't. Instead, she used every dollar of her small paycheck to keep alive the people he'd ruined. She chose to save lives instead of taking revenge. Why? Marcus looked down at his hands that had signed orders to kill countless people, hands that had built an empire on the bones of countless families, hands that had crushed Alina's family without hesitation. For the first time in 37 years, Marcus Wellington felt his hands grow heavy, not with a gun, not with money, but with guilt. 8 years earlier, on an October night, 19 year, old Alina Monroe sat by the window, waiting for her father to come home. He had promised he'd be back early that evening. He said he had something important to tell the family. He said everything was going to change. Alina didn't know what he meant, but she'd noticed the look in her father's eyes in the weeks before. Something heavy was pressing down on him, something he couldn't say out loud. She waited. The clock struck 8, then 9, then 10. Her mother began to worry, pacing the living room, fingers twisting the hem of her blouse. Samuel, 17 years old, sat at the dining table doing homework, glancing up at the door now and then. 11, midnight, 1 in the morning. Her father didn't come home. His phone couldn't be reached. Alina called the company where her father worked, but nobody answered. She called the police station, but they told her she had to wait 48 hours before filing a missing person report. She sat by the window until the sun rose. Her father never came back. The days that followed blurred into a nightmare without an ending. The police opened an investigation but found nothing. No body, no trace, no clues. Robert Monroe simply vanished as if he'd never existed. Alina watched her mother collapse a little more each day. Catherine had once been a strong woman, always smiling, always singing while she cooked, always hugging her children before bed. After that night, she never smiled again. She sat for hours staring out the window, waiting for a figure that would never appear. She forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot she still had 2 children who needed her. Elena had to leave school. She was in her 2nd year of nursing. Had dreamed of becoming a nurse since she was a child. That dream had to be set aside. She needed to work. She needed money for rent, for electricity, for her mother's medicine. She waited tables in the morning, washed dishes at a restaurant in the afternoon, and cleaned offices at night. 3 jobs, 18 hours a day. And it still wasn't enough. They lost their apartment after 6 months, moved into a cheap rented room on the outskirts of the city. Then lost that room too, moved into the basement of a friend's house. Then there was nowhere left to stay. They lived in her father's old car for 2 winter months. Samuel began to change. The boy who'd once been gentle, hardworking, always at the top of his class, grew quiet and distant. He dropped out of school, started running with the wrong crowd, started gambling to make fast money. Elena tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He said he'd save the family. He said he'd find out what happened to their father. He said he'd take revenge on the people who'd hurt him. Instead of revenge, he sank deeper into the mud. He lost money, lost badly, owed people he never should have owed. And one night, Elena received a call from the hospital. She ran there and found her brother on a stretcher, covered in blood, eyes tightly shut. The doctor said his spine was broken. He'd never walk again. He'd never care for himself again. He'd be confined to a bed for the rest of his life. Elena stood in the hospital corridor, looking at her brother through the glass, and couldn't cry. She'd cried too much already. There were no tears left. 6 months later, her mother died. Her heart couldn't take it anymore. She passed away in her sleep, alone in a public hospital room, because Elena was working a night shift and didn't make it in time. She didn't get to say goodbye. She buried her mother with borrowed money. She stood alone by the grave with nobody else present, because the rest of the family had turned their backs long ago, and she wondered what she had left. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. Her brother lay motionless. She was 20, 4 years old with no degree, no money, no future. But she still had to live, because Samuel needed hospital care, because she couldn't let him die a second time. Elena began looking for work, any work, and then she saw the posting. The Wellington mansion needed a housekeeper who could also serve as a night nurse. High pay, room and board included, no degree required. She knew that name, Wellington. She'd heard her father mention it. She'd seen the fear in his eyes whenever he talked about his job. She didn't have proof, but she knew. She knew in her bones that the Wellington family was connected to her father's disappearance. She knew they were monsters. And she applied anyway. She used her mother's maiden name, Miller, to make sure no shadow of her father's past would alert the man who had destroyed him. Not for revenge. She was too exhausted to think about revenge. She just needed money. She just needed Samuel to live. She just needed to survive today so she could face tomorrow. When Elena stepped through the gates of the Wellington mansion for the first time, she looked up at the massive building before her and told herself the truth. This was the enemy's lair. This was the place that swallowed her father. This was where she'd have to bow her head, serve, and pretend she knew nothing. She clenched her hands, stepped into the darkness, and buried everything, the pain, the hatred, the memory of her father. She buried it deep inside and locked it away. She wouldn't take revenge. She wouldn't let them see her weakness. She would live, and she would use the enemy's money to do the only thing that still had meaning: help people like her, people crushed by this very empire. That was how Elena Monroe entered Marcus Wellington's life. Not as a traitor, not as an assassin, but as a survivor, quietly gathering the fragments he left behind and trying to piece them back together into something that could still be called humanity. Marcus closed the file and sat motionless in the darkness for hours. He could kill her right now. All it would take was one order, one call. She would vanish the way her father had vanished 8 years earlier. Nobody would ask questions. Nobody would know. That was how his world worked. But he didn't do it. He didn't understand why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe he wanted to understand what could make a woman who had lost everything because of him choose not to seek revenge. Maybe it was because, for the first time in 37 years, he'd met someone whose next move he couldn't predict. In the days that followed, Marcus began to watch Alina, not through security cameras as before, but with his own eyes. He woke earlier than usual, sat in his study with the door slightly open, and watched her pass through the hallway. He saw her clean the living room at 5 in the morning, when the entire mansion was still asleep. She wiped every painting, every vase, every forgotten corner. Nobody else bothered to notice. She worked in silence, no music, no conversation, only the soft sound of her steps on the wooden floor. He saw her prepare breakfast for his men, those who woke with bloodshot eyes and breath heavy with alcohol. She didn't flinch, she didn't complain. She simply placed plates in front of them, poured coffee, then retreated to the corner of the kitchen as if she didn't exist. He saw her bandage the wounds of a worker who'd been slashed in a fight the night before. The man gripped her hand too tightly from the pain, his nails breaking her skin, but she didn't cry out. She gently loosened his grip, continued stitching the wound. And when she was done, she thanked him for enduring it. She thanked the man who had just made her bleed. Marcus watched from a distance, unable to understand. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty had a price. Silence had a price. Even love had a price. Nobody gave without demanding something in return. Nobody was kind without a reason. That was the rule. That was the truth he'd learned at 12 years old when his parents were killed. And he realized nobody truly cared about anyone. But Alina asked for nothing. She worked 16 hours a day for wages that barely covered her brother's medical care. She ate leftovers after everyone else was full. She wore the same 3 wore, not outfits with frayed shoulders. And every night, she carried heavy bags to the church basement to give to people even worse off than she was. She gave everything and she asked for nothing back. One afternoon, Marcus stood outside the kitchen door and watched Alina prepare dinner. She was making soup, a simple soup with potatoes and carrots, but she cooked carefully, seasoning it little by little, as if this were the most important meal in the world. He noticed she was dividing the soup into 2 portions. A large portion went into the refrigerator for his men. A smaller portion she poured into old plastic containers and neatly packed into her familiar bag. What about her share? He wondered. Then he realized she kept none for herself. She cooked for others, then went without. She gave away the last thing she had, and went to sleep with an empty stomach. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He'd met thousands of people in his life, the greedy ones who wanted his money, the ambitious ones who wanted his power, the fearful ones who knelt at his feet, the hateful ones who wanted him dead, but he'd never met anyone like Alina. Someone who wanted nothing from him, someone who knew he was a monster, knew he'd destroyed her family, and still chose to stay, not for revenge, but to save the people he'd harmed. He didn't understand her, and that unsettled him more than any threat he'd ever faced, because for the first time, he'd encountered something money and power couldn't buy, couldn't control, couldn't destroy, kindness, real kindness without profit, without conditions, and he didn't know what to do with it. A few days later, Marcus went to find Dorothy in the small kitchen behind the mansion. The 68-year-old woman was sitting there shelling beans, her wrinkled hands moving with the same practiced rhythm they'd kept for the past 30 years. She was the only person in the mansion who dared to look him straight in the eye without trembling. Maybe it was because she'd been there since his father was still alive. Maybe because she'd seen him cry over his parents' bodies when he was only 12. Maybe because to her, he was still the orphaned boy from long ago. Marcus sat down on the chair across from her and stayed silent for a while. Dorothy didn't ask anything. She kept shelling beans, waiting. She knew. What do you know about Alina? He finally asked. Dorothy looked up at him, her old eyes still sharp. She didn't seem surprised. Perhaps she'd been expecting this question for a long time. That girl, she said slowly, setting the basket of beans aside. I've known her for 3 years now, since the day she walked into this house." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "She never finishes her meals. At first, I thought she was a picky eater or that the food didn't suit her. But then I realized she always saved half, wrapped it up, and took it somewhere. I asked her once. She just smiled and said someone else needed it more." Dorothy shook her head, something passing through her eyes that Marcus couldn't read. "She works 16 hours a day, sir. Sometimes 18. She comes before dawn and leaves after everyone's asleep. She never complains, never asks for time off, never asks for a raise. I've never seen anyone work like that without a reason." Marcus stayed silent. He knew Elena's reason. She needed money for her brother. She needed to keep living so she could keep helping the people in the church basement. She didn't work for money for herself. She worked so others could live. There was one time, Dorothy continued, her voice softening, "I cut my hand while chopping vegetables. It was a deep cut, bleeding badly. She ran over and bandaged it as carefully as if I were her own family. She even made me a cup of hot tea, made me sit down and rest, then finished my work for me." Dorothy looked at Marcus, her gaze piercing. "I've lived in this house for 30 years, sir. I've seen every kind of person pass through. Men who kill without blinking. Men who lie as easily as breathing. Men who only know how to bow their heads and obey. But I've never seen anyone like her." She paused, took a deep breath. "She's the only good person who's walked through that door in 30 years. Truly good, not pretending, not for gain. She's good because that's who she is, no matter what life's done to her." Marcus didn't speak. He just sat there, watching Dorothy's worn hands continue shelling beans. "You know," Dorothy added, her voice dropping lower, "you're wondering what to do with her. I don't know what she's done to catch your attention. But there's one thing I want to say." She lifted her head and looked him straight in the eye. "Don't destroy her, sir. This world has already taken too much from her. Don't let you be the one who takes what little she has left." Marcus stood up without replying. He walked out of the kitchen, but Dorothy's words echoed in his mind. The only good person, 30 years, the only one, and he'd almost killed her over a few bags. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Dorothy's words echoed in his mind like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The only good person. Don't destroy her. Don't let you be the one who takes what little she has left. He tossed and turned until the sky began to lighten. Then made a decision he didn't fully understand himself. He would go see Samuel Monroe. The nursing facility was on the outskirts of Chicago. About 40 minutes from the mansion, Marcus went alone, without Theo, without any guards. He didn't want anyone to know about this trip. He wasn't even sure what he expected to find. Maybe he just needed to see it with his own eyes, to see the results of what he'd done. Not through words on paper, but in flesh and breath. Sunny Hills Nursing Home. The name sounded cruelly ironic. There was nothing sunny about the place. An old building with peeling paint. A patch of yellowed grass nobody tended. The sharp smell of cheap cleaning products hitting his nose the moment he stepped inside. Marcus told the person at the front desk he was a distant relative visiting Samuel Monroe. The young woman studied him with suspicion for a moment, his expensive suit painfully out of place in this gray world. But then she gave him directions. Room 2, 117, second floor, end of the hallway on the left. The corridor was narrow and dim, lights flickering as if ready to die. Marcus walked past closed doors, hearing dry coughs, low moans, the steady rhythm of breathing machines leaking through the walls. This was where people came to wait for death. This was where the forgotten finished out their days. And this was where Elena paid every month, so her brother could continue to exist. Room 217. Marcus stopped at the door, drew in a slow breath, then pushed it open. The room was smaller than he expected. A single bed, a small bedside table, an old plastic chair, a narrow window overlooking the parking lot. No flowers, no cards, no sign that anyone but Elena had ever visited this place. Samuel Monroe lay on the bed, motionless like a corpse. 25 years old, yet he looked like an old man. pale skin, hollow cheeks, eyes sealed shut, a breathing tube in his nose, and Roman IV-line in his arm. His body was so thin Marcus could count each rib beneath the thin hospital gown. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed, staring down at the human being his order had turned into this. Samuel had once been a 17-year-old boy with an entire future ahead of him. He'd had a father and a mother, a sister who loved him, dreams and hope. Then his father vanished, his mother collapsed, he fell trying to save his family in the only way a desperate 17-year-old could imagine. And he failed, and Marcus's men had taught him a lesson written in broken bone and blood. Marcus glanced at the bedside table and saw a small photo frame. He picked it up, and something tightened painfully in his chest. It was a family photograph of the Monroes: Robert, Catherine, Elena, and Samuel. They stood in front of a simple house with a white fence. Sunlight pouring down, all four of them smiling. Robert rested a hand on his wife's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. Catherine held her children close, her smile bright, untouched by suffering. Elena, 15 or 16 years old, hair in a ponytail, eyes bright, grinning as if the world belonged to her. And Samuel, 12 or 13, standing beside his sister, one arm raised as if greeting the future. They had been happy, they had once had everything, and he had taken it all. Marcus looked at the photo, then back at the still body on the bed, and realized his hand was shaking. He, Marcus Wellington, the man who'd ordered hundreds of deaths without blinking, was shaking. Not from fear, but from something he couldn't name. He set the frame down and took a step back. Samuel couldn't hear him, couldn't see him, couldn't know the man who destroyed his life was standing right there. But Marcus spoke anyway. His voice was low and rough, as if he were speaking to himself more than to Samuel. I didn't know who you were when I gave the order. It wasn't an apology. An apology would have been far too cheap for what he'd done. It was only the truth. A brutal truth to him. Samuel had been just another person who owed money among thousands. A name on a list. A problem to be handled. He hadn't thought about family, about a sister, about a mother waiting at home. He hadn't thought because he didn't need to. In his world, people were numbers, and numbers didn't feel. Marcus stayed in the small room a few more minutes, watching Samuel's chest rise and fall through the tube, watching the faint movement of breath, watching eyes sealed shut in an endless sleep. Then he turned and left. He couldn't stay any longer. Not because he was busy, but because the room was crushing him. As Marcus drove back to the mansion, he didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, just sat in silence with the steady hum of the engine. His hands still trembled slightly on the steering wheel. And for the first time in 37 years, he wondered when he had become a monster, or whether he'd been born one, and only realized it today. In the days that followed, Marcus began to act without explaining anything to anyone. He called Theo into his office and gave a series of short, clear orders. Increase Elena Monroe's salary to 3 times its current amount. Put it into an account she doesn't know the source of. Transfer Samuel Monroe to the best nursing facility in Chicago. A private room, top doctors, all expenses covered by me, and don't let her know who's paying. Theo studied him for a long moment, but didn't ask a single question. 20 years working for Marcus had taught him when silence was required. Yes, sir. That was all he said before leaving the room. A week later, Elena received a notice from the nursing facility informing her that her brother had been transferred to a new place. She called to ask questions, and they told her an anonymous helper had covered all expenses for the next 5 years. She didn't believe it. She went to the new facility and saw Samuel lying in a clean, large room, a window overlooking a garden in bloom. Nurses on duty 24 hours a day, modern machines watching every breath he took. She stood there for a long time, unable to understand what was happening. Marcus knew she was confused because he'd had her followed. He watched her stand by Samuel's bed for hours, holding her brother's hand, crying without sound. He watched her ask everyone she could who had helped her, Nobody knew, or nobody was allowed to say. He'd also ordered her salary increased, but she didn't notice right away. It wasn't until the end of the month when she checked her account that she saw the unusually large amount. She went to the office to ask about it, and they told her it was a decision from higher up, and she didn't need to know more. Elena knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what, and she didn't dare ask. One night, as she was cleaning the hallway on the 3rd floor, Marcus stepped out of his study. He stood there watching her mop the floor under the dim lights. She looked up and stopped, but didn't rise. "Sir, do you need something?" Her voice was calm as always, as if he were just her boss, and she were only a housekeeper. As if the rainy night at the church had never happened. Marcus stepped closer and stopped a few feet away. He looked down at her worn hands, hands that had wiped blood from his floors, stitched wounds for his men, cooked countless bowls of soup for people he'd destroyed. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly. Elena stood up, set the mop aside, and waited. She showed no fear. She never had, even though she knew who he was and what he'd done to her family. "Why don't you hate me?" Marcus asked directly. No evasion, no explanation. He needed to know. This question had haunted him since the night he read her file. "You know what I've done," he continued, his voice getting rougher. "I killed your father. I caused your mother's death. I turned your brother into a living corpse. I destroyed everything you had. And yet, you're still here, still working for me, still not poisoning my food or selling information to my enemies." Why, Elena was silent for a moment. She looked at him, eyes deep and unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I did hate you, every second of every minute during the first 2 years. I lay in that dirty rented room, imagining hundreds of ways to kill you. I dreamed of stabbing you. I pictured you dying in pain, the way my father died. Hatred ate me alive from the inside. It burned me every night." Marcus said nothing. He just stood there and listened, but then I realized something. Elena continued, "Hatred doesn't save anyone. It doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't heal my mother. It doesn't help Samuel stand again. It only turns me into the thing I hate most, someone who only knows how to destroy." She looked straight into his eyes. "I don't want to become you, Mr. Wellington." The words cut through Marcus like a blade. She wasn't trying to insult him. She was only telling the truth, and the truth hurt more than any curse ever could. "So, I chose another way," Elena went on. "I chose to save instead of destroy. I chose to give instead of take. I can't change the past, but I can choose who I'll become in the future." She bent down to pick up the mop as if the conversation were over. "Are you finished asking, sir? I still have the 2nd floor hallway to clean." Marcus didn't answer. He just stood there watching her walk away, her thin figure disappearing into the shadows, and he realized her answer didn't just explain why she didn't hate him. It forced him to ask himself why he had chosen to become the thing the entire world feared, instead of choosing to become something else. But darkness never leaves the light in peace. Nathan Harrington had been watching Marcus for a long time. 42 years old, the Eastern Chicago boss, the man who had waited 10 years to find Marcus Wellington's weakness. And at last he had found it. Nathan's men discovered Elena 3 weeks earlier when she left the mansion at night. They followed her to St. Mary's Church. They recorded everything, the people she helped, the bags she carried. And most importantly, they realized Marcus was watching her, too. The coldest man in Chicago, caring about a housekeeper. That was the weakness. That was the opportunity. Nathan moved on a night when Elena left the church later than usual. She had just stepped out of the alley when 2 black cars blocked her front and back. 4 men in black got out and surrounded her in seconds. Elena didn't have time to run. She was grabbed by the hair and dragged into the car. A black hood was pulled over her head. Her hands tied behind her back, and the car sped into the night. When the hood was removed, Elena found herself sitting inside an abandoned warehouse. In front of her stood Nathan Harrington, dressed in a black suit, hair slicked back, a smile sharp as a blade. And beside him, kneeling on the cold concrete floor, were Sophie Donovan and her 2 children. Emma and Ryan had their hands tied, tape over their mouths, eyes flooded with tears and terror. Sophie was shaking, looking at Alina with desperation. "Miss Bell," Sophie sobbed without sound, "I'm sorry. They came to the church and took us. I'm sorry." Alina felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She forced herself to stay calm and looked at Nathan. "What do you want?" Nathan stepped closer, crouching to her eye level. "I want Marcus Wellington," he said softly, as if talking about the weather. "And you're going to help me get him." "I'm just a housekeeper," Alina said. "I don't know anything about his business." Nathan laughed, the dry sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "Don't play games with me, little girl. I know who you are. I know what you do every night, and I know Marcus Wellington cares very much about you." He straightened and signaled to his men. A fist slammed into Alina's face. She hit the floor, tasting blood. Emma screamed through the tape, her voice breaking. Ryan whimpered. Sophie cried out, begging them to stop. But they didn't. A second kick to her stomach, a third punch to her ribs. Alina curled on the concrete, trying to shield herself. But she couldn't fight 4 grown men. They beat her until she no longer had the strength to moan. Nathan raised his hand, signaling them to stop. He knelt beside Alina, grabbed her hair, and yanked her head up. "You're going to spy for me," he whispered into her ear. "You'll tell me everything about Marcus, his schedule, his weaknesses, his plans. If you refuse, these 2 children will die." Alina looked at Emma and Ryan through swollen eyes. The children were trembling, eyes red, too frightened to understand what was happening. They were just children. They didn't belong in this bloody world. "No," Alina whispered, her voice raw. "I won't do it." Nathan tightened his grip in her hair. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Are you willing to let these children die because of your stubbornness?" Alina closed her eyes. She thought of her father, her mother, Samuel. All the people this world had taken. Then she opened her eyes and looked straight at Nathan. "You'll kill them no matter what I do," she said. "Men like you don't keep promises. I won't become a traitor for anyone." Nathan studied her for a long moment, then stood. He gestured to his men. They beat her again until she lost awareness. When Alina woke up, she was lying in the dark alley behind the church. Sophie and the children were gone. Beside her lay a crumpled note. "Tell Marcus what I'm holding. He has 3 days to hand over the Western Territory, or she and the children die together." Alina lay there, her body burning with pain, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth, and realized the darkness had come for her again. But this time it didn't only want to swallow her. It wanted to swallow everyone she loved. Alina didn't know how long she'd been lying in the alley. Maybe 1 hour, maybe 2. She only knew that when she came to, it was still dark, and her body hurt so badly she couldn't move. Every rib felt broken, every muscle felt torn apart. Dried blood crusted on her face, her hands, her thin clothes. But she still got up. She had to get up. Sophie and the children were being held. She couldn't lie there and die. She dragged herself out of the alley, clinging to the wall to stay upright. She didn't go to the hospital. She didn't have money for a hospital, and she couldn't let anyone know what had happened. If Marcus found out, he'd think she was involved with Nathan. He'd kill her before she could explain. She returned to the mansion before dawn, slipped in through the back door, washed her face in the small bathroom for the staff. She looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize who stared back. Swollen eyes, split lips, bruised cheeks. She used cheap powder to hide the bruises, wore long sleeves to cover the wounds on her arms, and went back to work like any other day. Nobody noticed, or nobody cared enough to notice. She was just a housekeeper. She had always been invisible. The days that followed dragged on like an endless nightmare. Alina worked 16 hours a day as usual, but her body was collapsing from the inside. Her ribs were broken. Every breath felt like a knife driving into her chest. Internal wounds bled quietly, though she didn't know it. She only knew she was growing weaker, dizzier, more short of breath by the day. She didn't eat, not because she chose to starve, but because she couldn't swallow. Every bite made her sick. She drank water to stay upright and kept working. For 3 years, she'd lived like this. 3 years of 60-hour days. 3 years of never eating enough, never sleeping enough. 3 years carrying the weight of her brother, the people in the church, everyone she couldn't abandon. Her body had been empty for a long time. Nathan's beating was only the final drop that made it overflow. On the 3rd night after the kidnapping, Elena was in the kitchen preparing dinner for Marcus's men. She was chopping vegetables, but the knife in her hand shook uncontrollably. The world began to spin. The lights blurred, the noise dissolved into a dull buzzing in her ears. She tried to grip the edge of the counter, but her legs no longer held her. She fell, the knife hit the floor with a cold metallic sound. Her body collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Her head struck the tile, but she felt no pain. She felt nothing at all. Darkness rushed in and swallowed her whole. Dorothy was the first to see her. She screamed, her cry echoing through the mansion. "Someone call a doctor." "Someone's fallen. Hurry." Marcus was in his study when he heard the scream. He didn't know why he ran. He never ran for anyone, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him down the hall, down the stairs, into the kitchen. And he saw her. Elena lay on the floor, motionless. Her face was pale as paper, her lips were gray. Her eyes were closed. The makeup had smeared away, revealing bruises on her cheeks, her forehead, her neck. Marcus dropped to his knees beside her, and for the first time in 37 years, he felt fear. Not fear of enemies, not fear of death, fear of losing her. He lifted her up and almost dropped her in shock. She was too light, so light it was unbelievable. He could feel every rib through her thin clothes, feel how fragile her body was, as if it might crumble in his arms. How had she lived like this for 3 years? What had she endured that he'd never seen? Call the doctor. He ordered, his voice rough. My private doctor now. He carried her to the living room and laid her on the sofa. Dorothy ran to make the call. His men stood frozen, not knowing what to do. They'd never seen their boss like this. Eyes red, hands shaking, his voice stripped of its usual coldness. Theo stepped forward, looked down at Elena, then at Marcus. He saw the bruises on her face, the injuries that didn't come from a fall. Who did this to her? Theo asked. Marcus didn't answer. He was watching Elena, watching her pale face, watching her chest rise and fall faintly. He didn't know who had beaten her, but he would find out, and when he did, that person would die. The doctor arrived 15 minutes later. He examined Elena and shook his head, his expression serious. 2 broken ribs, mild internal bleeding, severe lack of proper food, complete exhaustion. She hasn't eaten properly for a very long time. Her body is beyond its limits. Marcus stood still, taking in every word like a death sentence. "Save her," he said, his voice no longer an order, but almost a plea. "At any cost. I'll do everything I can." The doctor replied, "But sir, she needs rest, she needs care. She needs someone to care about her, not just medicine." Marcus looked down at Elena. She lay there, unmoving, fragile as a wilting flower. She'd given everything to her brother, to the people in the church, to strangers nobody else cared about, and she'd kept nothing for herself. She'd burned herself alive to keep others warm, until there was nothing left to burn, and he, Marcus Wellington, lord of half of Chicago, the man who controlled everything, hadn't seen it at all. He sat down beside her, staring at her pale face, and asked himself for the first time in his life, if she died, what would he do? And the answer made him shiver, because he didn't know. He truly didn't know. Elena woke after 2 days in a coma. The first thing she felt was light. Not the weak glow from the small room reserved for the staff, but sunlight. Warm and generous, pouring through white silk curtains. She blinked, trying to focus. The ceiling was higher than she remembered. The bed was wider than she remembered. The blankets were softer than she remembered. This wasn't her room. Elena tried to sit up, but the pain from her ribs tore a groan from her throat. She sank back down, breathing fast. Cold sweat beading on her forehead. She didn't need rest. She turned her head and saw Marcus sitting in the chair beside the bed. He was still wearing the black suit from the night she collapsed, now wrinkled and worn. Stubble covered his jaw. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. He looked like he'd been sitting there for 2 days without leaving. Seeing him like that, the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, the man who made the entire underworld tremble, keeping watch over a housekeeper, felt unreal. Sir, Elena's voice was rough from days of silence. "Where am I?" "My living room," Marcus replied, his voice low and exhausted. "The doctor said you need care. Your room is too small and doesn't get enough light." Elena didn't know what to say. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. She remembered that night. Nathan, Sophie, and the children, the punches and kicks, the note in the alley. 3 days. Nathan had given Marcus 3 days. And she'd been unconscious for 2 of them. "Who did this to you?" Marcus asked, cutting through her thoughts. His tone was calm, but something burned beneath it. Something dangerous. Elena stayed silent. She didn't want to speak. Not because she wanted to protect Nathan, but because she knew if she did, Marcus would kill him. And Sophie and the children would be dead before he ever reached them. "I know it was Nathan," Marcus continued as if reading her mind. "My people investigated. He kidnapped 3 people from your church. A woman and 2 children. He wants to use them to pressure me." Elena closed her eyes, so he knew. "I'll kill him." Marcus said, his voice cold as ice, "I'll find where he's hiding them, get them out, and tear him apart piece by piece." Elena opened her eyes and looked at him. She saw the anger in his gaze, real anger, not the calculated fury he used in business. He was angry for her, for the people she protected. It made her want to smile, and it made her want to cry. "Killing more people won't change anything," she said, weak but clear. Marcus frowned. "You're telling me to let the man who beat you nearly to death go free?" "No," Elena shook her head slightly. "I'm saying that even if you kill Nathan or 100 men like him, this world won't change. There will still be men like him. There will still be people like me who get crushed, because this is the world people like you created." Marcus said nothing. He just looked at her. Elena drew a slow breath, pain flaring in her ribs, but she continued. "Do you know what truly exhausts me, Mr. Wellington? Not the work, not the sleepless nights, not eating too little or resting too little." She looked straight into his eyes tired, yet lit by something he couldn't name. "What exhausts me is seeing good people crushed every day and knowing I can't save them all. Seeing children orphaned because their fathers were killed. Seeing women thrown onto the streets because their husbands knew too much. Seeing men lose arms and legs over a single mistake." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. She'd cried too much already. There were no tears left. "You didn't kill me with a gun, Mr. Wellington," she said, each word carved as if into stone. "You killed me by making this world a place where good people have no room to exist. You crush everything and everyone, then wonder why there's nothing left around you but darkness." The room fell silent. Marcus stood. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. Then turned toward the door, but Elena saw his shoulders shake. For the first time, she saw Marcus Wellington tremble. Not from fear, not from rage, but from something deeper. Something he might not even know how to name. He left the room and closed the door behind him. And Elena lay alone in the unfamiliar luxury of the room. She didn't know whether her words would change anything. She only knew they were true. And sometimes the truth is the only thing she still has left to give. Marcus left the room and walked straight to his office. He closed the door, stood in the darkness, and let Elena's words echo in his mind. "You killed me by making this world a place where good people can't exist." He'd heard countless curses in his life. Countless pleas, countless cries of despair, but nothing had ever cut as deeply as that sentence, because it was true. He knew it was true. He'd built a world where good people couldn't survive. A world where kindness was a weakness. A world where people like Elena had to work 16 hours a day, go hungry, go without, just to save the fragments he'd left behind. He picked up the phone and called Theo. Gather everyone. 15 minutes later, the largest meeting room in the mansion was packed. His most senior workers, men who'd followed him for 10 years, 20 years, sat around the long table waiting. They knew something serious was happening. They just didn't know what. Marcus entered, stood at the head of the table, and spoke in a voice cold as steel. "Find Nathan Harrington. Find where he's holding the hostages. A woman named Sophie Donovan and 2 children, Emma and Ryan. Get them out first. After that, bring Nathan to me alive." The men nodded. Nobody dared ask why. Obeying was second nature to them. But Marcus wasn't finished. "There's one more thing." He took out a sheet of paper and placed it on the table. "This is a list. The people at St. Mary's Church on 63rd Street. Discarded former workers, families of the dead, widows, orphans. From now on, nobody touches them. Anyone who does answers to me." The room fell silent. The men exchanged confused looks. Marcus Wellington, a man who'd never cared about meaningless things like compassion or mercy, was protecting a group of homeless people. "Is there a problem, sir?" one of the workers asked cautiously. "Why should we protect people like that?" "They're just trash." Marcus looked straight into his eyes. His gaze was so cold the man dropped his head. "Because I ordered it." Marcus said, "That's the only reason you need." Nobody spoke again. The meeting ended. The men filed out to carry out their orders. Only Theo remained. He stood beside Marcus, studying his boss with an expression Marcus couldn't read. "Have you changed?" Theo asked bluntly. Marcus didn't turn around. He looked out the window down at the city he controlled by half, and answered quietly, "No, I'm still a monster." He paused, drew in a deep breath. "But there are things even monsters shouldn't touch. There are people even darkness should stay away from." He turned to Theo. "She showed me that, and I owe her. Not an apology, because apologies are too cheap, but action. Protecting what she protects, not destroying anymore." Theo was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I understand." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Sir, yes, she's someone special." Theo said, "Don't lose her." Marcus didn't answer. He stood there, staring out the window, wondering whether he deserved to keep someone like Elena by his side. The answer was no. He knew that. But he would try. For the first time in 37 years, Marcus Wellington decided to try to become something other than a monster. 3 days later, when Elena was strong enough to sit up, Marcus did something nobody expected. He went to St. Mary's Church alone. No guards, no weapons. Just him and the black car parked quietly at the edge of the familiar dark alley. That night, it wasn't raining, but the air was still damp and heavy. Marcus stepped out of the car and looked up at the old church. Its crooked bell tower leaning slightly, its stained glass windows cracked and broken. The last time he'd been here, he'd come as a shadow, hiding in the darkness, one hand resting on a gun. This time was different. He walked straight to the front door. Not hiding, not avoiding anyone. He knocked. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. Just like Elena had, the door opened. Father Thomas Mitchell stood there, 50, 8 years old, his face weathered by hardship, his eyes sharp as blades. He recognized Marcus instantly. Everyone in the Chicago underworld knew that face, Father Thomas said, his voice cold as ice. "You're not welcome here, I know." Marcus replied calmly, "You're the one who destroyed this place." Father Thomas continued, his voice trembling with anger. "You drove hundreds of families onto the streets. How many people from my church have you killed? How many children are orphans because of you? How many widows have cried until they had no tears left? And now you stand at God's door as if you have the right." Marcus didn't argue. He stood there and listened, letting every word strike him like a knife. "You're right," he said after a long silence. "Everything you said is true." Father Thomas froze. He'd prepared himself for arrogance, for threats, for violence. He hadn't prepared for this, for admission. "I didn't come here to be welcomed." Marcus continued, his voice low and steady. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. My apology would be too cheap for what I've done. Then why are you here?" Father Thomas asked, still gripping the door. "To pay a debt." Marcus met the priest's eyes. Not a debt to God? I don't believe in God. A debt to the people I've harmed, to the people Elena is protecting. Father Thomas studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read something hidden behind Marcus's eyes. Then he sighed and stepped aside. Come in. But if you harm anyone here, I swear to God I'll kill you myself. Even if it sends me straight to hell. Marcus nodded and stepped inside, then headed down the stairs to the basement. The moment he entered, the room fell into a dead silence. People stopped eating, stopped talking, almost stopped breathing. They recognized him. Of course they did. How could they not recognize the man who'd destroyed their lives? Elena stood in the corner, handing medicine to an elderly woman. She turned at the sound of footsteps, and her eyes widened when she saw Marcus at the foot of the stairs. Mr. Wellington, she whispered, disbelief flooding her face. What are you doing here? Marcus didn't answer her. He looked around the room at every face, faces hollowed by hunger, faces worn down by suffering, faces he'd helped turn into this without ever knowing. Then he saw David Patterson. The one-legged man sat in the corner, a half-eaten bowl of soup in front of him. When David realized who'd just walked in, he sprang up, or tried to, his wooden crutch shaking violently in his hand. You, David roared, his eyes burning with hatred. You dare come here? He tried to lunge at Marcus, but his missing leg threw him off balance. Elena rushed forward and caught him, holding him back. Mr. David, please, she said. Please calm down, calm down, David screamed. He took my leg, he took my life. And you tell me to calm down. I know, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying through the room. I know what I took from you. He walked forward, slow step by slow step, until he stood just a few feet away from David. Then he did something nobody expected. Marcus Wellington knelt. His knees touched the cold concrete floor. The entire room gasped. Elena stood frozen. Father Thomas stopped halfway down the stairs, unable to believe what he was seeing. The most powerful crime boss in Chicago was kneeling before a homeless man with one leg. I took your leg, Marcus said roughly. I can't give it back. Nothing can give it back. He looked up at David, his eyes no longer cold. There was something else there now, not exactly guilt, not quite regret, but recognition, acceptance that he'd been wrong. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness, he continued. I came to pay my debt, not with words, with actions. From now on, nobody in my organization will touch you or anyone here. I'll make sure you have housing, food, medicine. Not because I want you to forgive me, but because it's what I owe. David stared at him, hatred still burning in his eyes, but something beneath it wavered. He didn't speak, didn't accept, didn't refuse. He just stood there, staring at the man who destroyed his life, now kneeling at his feet. Marcus stood up and looked around the room one last time. I know you hate me, he said to everyone. You have every right to. I'm not asking you to stop hating me. I'm only asking you to give me a chance to prove I can do things differently. Nobody spoke. The silence was crushing. Marcus turned and walked toward the stairs. As he passed Elena, he paused for a second, looked at her, and spoke so softly only she could hear. Thank you for showing me there was another way. Then he climbed the stairs and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who didn't know what to think. And Elena standing there with tears in her eyes, not understanding why they were there. In the days that followed, Marcus began taking apart what he'd built over the past 20 years. Not all of it. He was still the boss. He still controlled half of Chicago's underworld. But he started cutting away the parts he knew had caused the deepest suffering. His first order was to shut down the Southside casino. It had once been one of his biggest sources of income. Every night, hundreds of people poured in, gambled, lost money, and sank into debt. And when they couldn't pay, his men came with knives, with hammers, with methods nobody wanted to think about. Samuel Monroe had been one of them. Shut it down, Marcus told Theo immediately. Fire everyone, burn the debt books. Anyone who still owes money from that casino, erase it all. Sir, the Southside casino brings in nearly $2 million a month. One senior worker protested, closing it will seriously impact our revenue. Did I ask for your opinion? Marcus said, locking eyes with him. The man lowered his head and said nothing more. The second order was to stop all removals in Southside. Families being forced out of their homes to make way for his new development were allowed to stay. Unpaid rent debts were wiped clean. Empty apartments were opened to the homeless. "Have you lost your mind?" another worker shouted during the meeting. "We've invested millions into the new harbor project. If we can't clear those people out, the project is dead." "Then let it die," Marcus replied coldly. The room fell silent. Nobody could believe what they were hearing. Marcus Wellington, the man who'd never hesitated to use any means necessary to expand his empire, was willing to abandon a multi-million-dollar project for a group of homeless people. The third order was the creation of an anonymous relief fund. Money would be transferred to St. Mary's Church every month to support the people Elena was protecting. Food, medicine, clothing, housing, everything they needed. Nobody was to know where the money came from. To them, it would simply be an anonymous helper. Marcus didn't need their thanks. He wasn't doing this to be thanked. But not everyone accepted the change. During that meeting, 3 senior workers stood up and looked at Marcus with something he'd never seen from them before. Not fear, not respect, but challenge. "You're destroying everything we've built," one of them said coldly. "For a maid, for a group of worthless people, you've lost your mind." Marcus didn't get angry. He simply looked at the man with empty eyes. "You have 2 choices," he said slowly. "Accept it and stay or leave. I'm not keeping anyone who doesn't want to be here." The 3 men exchanged glances, then stood. "We're leaving," one of them said, "and you'll regret this. Without us, your empire will collapse. Nathan Harrington will swallow you whole. And when that happens, don't expect us to come back." They walked out and slammed the door behind them. The room fell into silence. The remaining workers looked at Marcus, waiting for his reaction. He didn't react. He stared out the window at the city he'd controlled for 2 decades, and spoke as if to himself. "I built this empire on other people's blood and tears. I crushed hundreds of families to get what I have today. And I asked myself if any of it was worth it." He turned back to the men still seated. "The answer is no. None of it was worth it. I have more money than I can spend. Power I use for nothing but making people afraid. I have everything and I have nothing. No family, no friends, nobody who truly cares about me. Only people who fear me and people who want me dead." He took a slow breath. "I don't know if I can become a good man. Maybe I can't. Maybe it's too late. But I can choose not to make things worse. I can choose to stop. I can choose to destroy what shouldn't exist. Even if I built it with my entire life." Nobody spoke. They just sat there listening, and for the first time saw their boss as a man, not a monster. The meeting ended, the loyal stayed, the dissenters left. Marcus knew some of them would run to Nathan, sell information, become enemies. He didn't care. He'd accepted that doing the right thing had a price, and he was willing to pay it. Because for the first time in 37 years, he was doing something not for money, not for power, not for fear, but because he wanted to, because he chose to, because a fragile woman with deep, tired eyes had shown him that life could mean something other than crushing others. Despite her lingering pain and the doctor's orders to rest, Elena had quietly returned to St. Mary's a few days later. Unable to stay away from the people who relied on her for their survival, Nathan Harrington didn't wait any longer. When Marcus's traitorous workers joined his side, carrying news of the weakening Wellington Empire, he knew the moment had come. That night, Nathan led 30 armed men to St. Mary's Church. He no longer wanted to use hostages as pressure. He wanted to send a message. He wanted the entire underworld to see that Marcus Wellington had grown soft, and that anyone who dared stand with him would die. Sophie and the 2 children were still being held in Nathan's warehouse, but he no longer cared about them. They were just bait. The real goal was to destroy everything Marcus was trying to protect: the church, the people inside. And if luck favored him, Elena too. What Nathan didn't know was that Marcus had been watching him for days. When Nathan's group left the Eastern District, Theo called Marcus immediately. "He's heading to the church." 30 men, heavy weapons. Marcus didn't hesitate. He gathered his most loyal workers, 20 men, and drove toward Southside faster than ever before. He wasn't going to defend territory. He was going to protect the people Elena loved. By the time Marcus arrived, gunfire was already echoing. Nathan had begun the assault. The church doors were blown open. Screams spilled out from inside. Children crying, glass breaking, gunshots cracking again and again. Marcus leapt from the car, drew his weapon, and charged in. He didn't think about himself. He didn't think about dying. He only thought about Elena inside, about David, about the orphan children, about everyone he'd promised to protect. The fight was short and brutal, 20 against 30 in the cramped space of the old church. Bullets tore through rotting wooden benches. Blood spread across the cold stone floor. The screams of the wounded echoed beneath the high ceiling. Marcus fought like a true monster. He didn't take cover. He didn't retreat. He advanced, shooting men down one by one. Stepping over their bodies, searching for Nathan, he found him in the basement. Nathan was standing there, gun trained on Elena. She was shielding several children with her body, fear in her eyes, yet she refused to step back. Wellington. Nathan laughed when he saw Marcus. "You finally showed up. I knew she was your weakness. Drop the gun," Marcus said, his voice cold as ice. Nathan laughed louder. "You think you can order me around? You're finished, Wellington. You've grown weak. You've forgotten who you are, and I'm going to remind you." He swung the gun toward Elena, his finger tightening on the trigger. Marcus didn't have time to think. He lunged forward, throwing himself into the line of fire. The bullet tore through his chest. Pain exploded so intense he nearly collapsed. But he didn't fall. He raised his gun and fired. One shot straight through Nathan's forehead. The East Side boss of Chicago fell. His eyes still open, never understanding what had happened. Marcus stood there for 1 second, 2 seconds. Then his legs gave out. Blood poured from the wound in his chest, staining the concrete red. He heard Elena scream. "Marcus," she ran to him, catching him in her arms. "Don't die," she sobbed, tears spilling onto his face. "Please don't die. You can't die." Marcus looked up at her face, already blurring as he lost too much blood. He wanted to say something. He wanted to say he didn't regret it. He wanted to say that for the first time in his life he'd done the right thing. He wanted to say she'd changed him, but he couldn't speak. Darkness rushed in, swallowing him whole. The last thing he heard was Elena calling his name, and the last thing he felt was her arms holding him tight, as if she refused to let go. Even if it meant following him into hell, Marcus survived. The bullet that tore through his chest missed his heart by only a few inches. The doctor said it was a miracle. He lay in intensive care for an entire week, suspended between life and death. Elena didn't leave. She sat by his bed every day, changing his bandages, checking his wound, making sure he was cared for properly. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because he'd saved her. Maybe because he'd stepped between her and the bullet without hesitation. Maybe because she'd seen something in him she'd never expected to find. A month after the battle, Marcus could walk again, though he was still weak. The wound in his chest still ached whenever he took a deep breath, but he didn't complain. He was used to pain. What he wasn't used to was the feeling that came over him when he saw Elena smile. She smiled more these days. Not a bright smile, but a real one. Sophie and the 2 children had been rescued shortly after Nathan died. They were safe. The church was being repaired. The people Elena protected now had stable shelter, food, and medicine. Things were better, but the real miracle came one March afternoon when Elena received a call from the nursing home. She nearly dropped the phone when she heard the news. Samuel was showing signs of waking. She ran to the facility, her heart racing, hardly daring to believe it. 7 years. 7 years her brother had lain motionless like a corpse. 7 years she'd visited him, held his hand, talked to him even though she believed he couldn't hear her. 7 years she'd prayed even after she'd stopped believing in God. The doctors called it a medical miracle. A near impossible awakening that defied 7 years of silence, likely sparked by the elite specialists and advanced treatments Marcus had secretly provided. When Elena stepped into the room, she saw Samuel lying there, his eyes slightly open, eyes she hadn't seen in 7 years. Eyes that had once sparkled when he was a 17-year-old boy with his whole future ahead of him. "Samuel," Elena whispered, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. "It's me." Samuel slowly turned his head toward her. His dry, cracked lips trembled, fighting through years of not moving to catch a ghostly breath of a word. "Sis," just one word, rough, weak, but it was her brother's voice, the voice she'd thought she'd never hear again. Elena couldn't hold back anymore. She rushed to the bed, wrapped her arms around him and cried. She cried like she never had before. She cried for 7 years of waiting. She cried for her lost parents. She cried for all the nights she'd thought she couldn't go on. "You're awake," she sobbed. "You're awake. I'm here. I'm always here." Samuel couldn't speak much. His body was still fragile. The doctors said he'd need months of recovery, maybe a year. The doctors confirmed he would never walk again. But he was awake, he was alive, he was here, and for Elena, that was everything. Marcus stood outside the hospital room, watching through the small glass window. He saw Elena holding her brother. He saw her shoulders trembling as she cried. He saw the smile mixed with tears on her face. He didn't go in. This was her moment, her family's moment. He had no right to intrude. He turned to leave, but Elena called out, "Marcus." He stopped and turned. Elena stood at the doorway, her eyes red, her cheeks wet with tears. But she was smiling, the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything, for Samuel, for the church, for not killing me that night, for changing." Marcus didn't know what to say. He only gave a small nod and turned away, but after a few steps, he stopped without looking back. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm just paying a debt." Then he disappeared down the corridor, leaving Elena standing there with a smile still on her lips. And for the first time in 8 years, she felt like she could breathe again. Like the weight on her shoulders had finally lifted, just a little. Like there might be hope at the end of the dark tunnel after all. 6 months later, St. Mary's Church was no longer a temporary shelter hidden in the shadows. It had become a true community center, with a new tiled roof, restored stained glass windows, and a renovated basement turned into a clean dining hall with sturdy wooden tables. Every day, dozens of people came here, not just to eat, but to learn skills, to find work, to begin their lives again. David Patterson was now in charge of the job training program for former prisoners. He stood on his crutches, but his voice was strong and full of life. As he told newcomers how he'd survived and moved forward, Sophie Donovan worked in the kitchen, cooking for people who'd once lived lives just like hers. Emma and Ryan ran across the newly built playground, their laughter echoing through the space. Father Thomas still stood at the door every morning, greeting everyone with a warm smile. He no longer looked at Marcus with hatred, not because he'd forgiven him. Some things couldn't be forgiven, but he'd accepted that people could change and that actions mattered more than words. Marcus was still the boss of half of Chicago's underworld. He didn't become a saint. He was still cold in business, still made tough decisions when necessary, still someone many feared, but there were things he no longer did. He didn't force families out of their homes to build casinos. He didn't run loans against the poor. He didn't kill people simply because they knew too much. His empire had shrunk, but what remained was cleaner, if anything in the underworld could ever be called clean. Samuel was now able to sit up and talk, though he still couldn't walk. Elena visited him every day, telling him about life, about the church, about the people she was helping. She didn't talk about Marcus. Some things were too complicated to explain. But one day, Samuel asked, "Who's paying for my care, sis?" Elena was quiet for a moment, then answered, "Someone who's trying to fix his mistakes." Samuel looked at her, something bright flickering in his eyes. "Like you've been doing for the past 7 years?" Elena smiled. "Maybe so." That evening, Elena stood on the balcony of the Wellington mansion, looking out over the city. She was no longer a maid. Marcus had offered her the position of community center director, with a salary that allowed her to live comfortably and care for Samuel. She accepted, not for the money, but because she wanted to continue the work she'd been doing for 3 years. Only now, she didn't have to do it alone in the dark. Marcus stepped onto the balcony and stood beside her. The scar on his chest still ached when the weather turned cold, but he never complained. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Elena looked at him, then back at the city. "I'm thinking about the night you followed me. The night you stood in the church basement with your hand on your gun, ready to kill me." Marcus stayed silent. "And I wonder what changed. What made you go from someone who was about to kill me to someone who stood between me and a bullet?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked down at the city lights flickering in the night and spoke slowly. "You showed me there was another way to live. That power doesn't have to come with destruction. That even in darkness there can still be light." He turned to her. "I'm still a monster, Elena. I don't know if I can ever become a good man. Maybe I can't. But you taught me that even monsters can choose not to destroy everything." Elena looked at him, her deep eyes reflecting something he didn't dare name. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice rough. "Not as a maid, but stay with me." Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, at the man who'd killed her father, indirectly killed her mother, and left her brother disabled. And she also saw the man who'd knelt before David, who'd stepped in front of a bullet for her, who'd torn down part of his own empire to make things right. "I'm staying for the people who need me," she said, "for Samuel, for the church, for David and Sophie and the children." She paused, then added softly, almost like a breath, "And for you, because you need me too, even if you don't want to admit it." Marcus took her hand, the first time he'd ever held someone's hand not to threaten or control. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Nobody ever really does," Eleanor replied, "but we still try." They stood there in silence, looking out over the city below. Two people from two different worlds, bound by pain and guilt, trying to build something new, not a fairy tale love, not a perfect ending, just two people learning how to live together in a world full of darkness. Marcus Wellington had spent 37 years building an empire with blood and tears. He didn't become a good man. Maybe he never would, but he learned something essential. True power isn't the ability to destroy. It's the ability to choose not to destroy. And beside him stood a woman who taught him that by surviving everything he'd caused. And still choosing to stay, not because she forgave him, but because she believed that even darkness could learn not to swallow the light. This story offers us a deep lesson about redemption and compassion, that nobody is born a monster, and nobody completely loses the ability to change. That sometimes the smallest light can melt the greatest darkness. That kindness isn't weakness, but the greatest strength a human being can possess. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone like Elena in your life? Someone who kept their kindness despite enduring so much pain? Or have you ever seen someone change like Marcus, stepping out of darkness in search of light? Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family good health, peace, joy, and happiness every day.